If there's one thing that I've learned in healthcare and in dental is that the data doesn't lie in the long run. It tells you the truth. And what the data tells me in dental is that you better have a local owner.
Hi, my name is Amal Nirgutkar, and I'm here with my co-host AJ Peak. Welcome to Healthcare 100, the ultimate playbook for scaling in healthcare. And each week we sit down with operators, investors, innovators behind the fastest growing DSOs, MSOs, and health tech platforms. And what we do is we unpack strategies, systems, and capital structures that drive real growth. And then we ask our audience on $100,000 idea that could really help somebody to implement it right away in 90 days that will drive growth. With that introduction, I want to welcome Larry Benz, the CEO of Dental Care Alliance, to this podcast. Super excited. Larry is the CEO of Dental Care Alliance and a client of Patient Prism. And we're so excited to talk to him about the intersection of empathy and AI and the future of human-centered dentistry. Thank you, Larry, for gracing our show.
Well, you're welcome. It's incredibly pleasing to be here. I'm honored to be on your podcast. I'm a big fan of your product, and I'm a big fan of your marketing approach and really your lectures and things that you've really helped. And I've learned quite a bit from you. So I appreciate that as well.
Thank you so much for the compliment. Let me start right off the bat with you started your career in physical therapy. You started one of the most prominent PT platforms in the nation, Confluent. And the challenge is, one of the things you talk about in Call to Care, your philosophy was like, how do you focus on the provider flourishing in any industry, whether it's PT, dentistry, or any other medical industry? The focus on provider flourishing is something that you've talked about a lot. And as you lead DCA in 2026, how are you translating that ideal Call to Care philosophy into dentistry so that the providers are flourishing?
Well, thanks. It's a great question. And to put it in context, I'm a physical therapist by background. And as a physical therapist in the military, I started a private practice in PT. We built it up to a number of clinics in the 1990s. And we then took on some private equity dollars. We went public, we went private, and had an incredible time building a very, very successful business. Shortly after that, I wanted a different view of the industry of healthcare in particular. I wanted in the physical therapy world, I wanted a combination of an education training company plus an occupational health on-site physical therapy. Plus I wanted what we're good at, which was our backbone, our bread and butter, which is operating outpatient physical therapy centers. And so we did it under a very strong M&A model and a de novo model where we enlisted physical therapists to be partners with us at the local level and at the topco level. And we did that over a period of years. And currently that company, which I'm still the largest individual shareholder, is at 850 plus locations, a very thriving educational business, and certainly an on-site health business that's very, very good, a network management business. And I stepped from the founder CEO role into a executive chair role, and then where I'm at now, which is a founder role. And I would say entering the dental world, I came on the board of Dental Care Alliance in the summer of 2024. Thought I was done at the CEO seat, although, I don't know that you're ever done if it's a role that you like. And so I entered the dental industry as a CEO in a little over a year ago now. And what I found is that they're very, very similar kinds of businesses. Most people, most investors, whether it be a private equity fund or individual investors or board members, tends to look at these businesses as multi-site unit economic businesses. I've always rejected that. I've always seen these businesses as human capital talent management businesses. Those who have the best dentist wins, those who have the best hygienist win, those who have the best PTs win. And so we always took on this people-centric approach and an outcome-driven approach. So in healthcare, you have a lot of standardization around clinical outcomes. And in dentistry, oddly enough, I have yet to see very many of them that are standardized. They just aren't. But aside from that, we fundamentally tried to do three things really, really well as an oblique way of creating success. Success never happens because you focus on EBITDA, you focus on growth, you focus on revenue cycle management, you focus on all those kind of things. You might get some success, but if you really focus on the right things that drive through success, you got to do it obliquely. So we focused on a clinical excellence. You have to have really sound dentists and providers. And so our providers, we initially, starting last January, we introduced the DCA Academy to upskill our dentists, get them trained in the better procedures, get them more into a general residency kind of frame of mind, get their clinical readiness and their clinical confidence top notch. Because if you can become a master clinician, you inure all kinds of benefits, management and business wise, that help you later. Good clinicians can make good managers, but you have to be a great clinician first. And so clinical excellence is paramount. The second is embed led that around unbelievable customer service. And so we had a proprietary customer service program that my company wrote called Amazing. And I was able to take Amazing and apply it to the dental industry. And Amazing is a set of 10 principles around customer service that have to be lived. They have to be taught. They have to be redefined. They have to be monitored. They have to be rewarded and highlighted and become embedded within your culture. And so we did that in 2026. And we took Amazing to an incredible level. We have Amazing coins. We recognize these things. We have zingers and all these other kind of things to create an atmosphere where people can thrive because they're empowered to do the right thing for the patient. And what happens is that then bleeds over into your culture of how you treat one another. And it bleeds in your culture of how you treat your referral sources and how you treat your community and become a better, culture. Because I learned a long time ago that all things being equal, the company, the team that has the best culture usually wins. All things not being equal, the team that has the best culture and the best team can oftentimes still win. And so culture is really critical. So we had the clinical excellence down pretty good. We introduced the customer service component of it. And the third leg of that stool is what I call care excellence or compassion and empathy. Because what I found out in the healthcare world is you could have the best trained providers, but if they didn't have any bedside manner, if they didn't have any good way of communicating, they didn't have any good way of listening, that they would have suboptimal outcomes. In fact, I studied it, did a whole master's thesis on it. I went back to school as a CEO to University of Pennsylvania, the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, to find one thing, to learn what are the non-clinical factors of success that can make a clinician and a patient successful. Because I had known from the military, and I knew from a lot of other research that the predictors of success weren't necessarily scientific objective measurements. They were qualitative instruments. I knew if somebody was in workers' comp and they were the best predictor of whether they went back to work or not wasn't the clinical intervention. It was, did you call them? And did their supervisor call them and say, look, we're anxious for you to get back to work. We really care about you. Come back. As a famous Boeing study. There were a bunch of other studies we did in the military that really showed that the predictors were psychosocial issues, not clinical issues. And so what are those non-clinical factors of success that impact outcome? Listening, communication, connectivity, peak end effect, all kinds of loss aversion, and all kinds of other things that we could train our practitioners that would influence. And that became known as called the care, which is the whole notion that you could take these non-clinical factors and objectify them enough to teach clinicians and then have an impact on your practice. Those are the three things we integrated from a human capital standpoint. Now, what are the benefits of it? You talk about marketing. We love your product. It's a terrific product. I wish that I had that a few years ago. But what we found is that the best predictor of future patients is your current patients. And if they are comfortable in your environment, in fact, in dentistry, one of the ironies I found about dentistry, completely different than healthcare, is dentistry is so much more transactional. I didn't experience that as a physical therapist and in primary care and occupational health. It was a relationship driven. So one of the areas we've really focused on is how can we drive our transaction-oriented patients, the ones who come from ZocDoc, the ones who come from all these other lead generating funnel machines, and turn them from a lead to a patient, to a friend, to an ambassador who refers their friends and family. And the combination of friends, family, former patients, I found that in healthcare, I can drive 33% of our new patients through that factor. And in dentistry, we're seeing the same thing. And you couple that with AI and products like yourself that allow you to then identify those patients that you missed the mark on, that you didn't establish the right caring, compassionate relationship with. Why didn't they come in? And you call them and you find out, and you can do a lot more conversion that way. So that's, a long-winded answer to tell you that that's how I've approached dentistry, is really a similar way, not as a unit economic, not as a business to invest in for growth that is recession-proof and all these kind of things that we said for years around the table, but how can we do it from a human capital relationship-oriented approach?
Incredibly refreshing, having built a small, mid-sized DSO. And my father's a dentist. I can tell that you have a heart as a provider. Very refreshing coming from, the private equity mantra that, it's a bunch of numbers and, lead by metrics. When you think of clinical excellence, your customer service program, the care excellence program, you still have a challenge, which Dental Care Alliance, 400 some locations. If you're a new entrepreneur, you've got 20 locations or you got 50 locations, how did you scale it? Like, it sounds amazing. It's refreshing, but how did you sit down with the team a year ago and say, we're going to disseminate these three things? Like, tactically, what are some of the things that you would coach others to do to kind of put that into motion?
It's a great question. Let me start out. I think you can scale purpose really well. You can scale purpose much more than profits. You can scale, certainly empathy, compassion. You can scale that through teaching and through emphasizing it, and a lot of things I can get into if you like. But I think the number one thing you have to do is to remind healthcare professionals professionals and dental professionals that they do meaningful, impactful work. Because what happens is every day a dentist goes in the office or a physician goes into the office, and there's a psychological principle called habituation, which effectively says you become numb to the fact that what you're doing is really incredible work. You're transforming people into a healthy lifetime smile. You're making people walk and run again. But you get so used to it that you forget that it's effectively a minor miracle. And so one of the things you have to do is tie your company's mission into a practical application of meaningful, purposeful work. Well, at DCA, we do a lifetime of healthy smiles. We advance the dental professional by partnering with dentists, very dentist-centric, those kind of things. But you have to make sure that they understand meaningful, purposeful. So how do you scale that? One of the ways you scale it is through a technique I call remind, which is RE:MIN, which is to remind them frequently of what they're doing. Patient testimonials, showing pictures, having the relationships in the stories and rewarding those stories. And as CEO, one of my favorite things to do is to tell stories and reward stories about how we're doing. So everything all about a lifetime of healthy smiles and how we continue to create that and do that. So it has to begin with your mission and understanding it. DCA is an interesting company. It's a 35-year-old legacy industry. How many DSOs are 35 plus years old? There's not many of them, right? So this is like one of the originals here. I think right now there's 170 plus, but this one's been around for a long time. How do we leverage that legacy to our future success? So I'm very big on honoring the past, celebrating the present, and embracing the future. Well, embracing the future, we're pretty good. Where natural inclination is to look at all the shiny tools and objects and do that because DCA's one of its missions is to innovate and really shape the future of dentistry. But celebrating the present is really, really important. We're so dentists and all of our left, and again, I'm a provider, so I'm a left brain kind of guy too. But how do we take that left brain, but make it a little bit more right brain oriented and get people to understand and celebrate and create a culture around honoring? And so we give out these service coins called Amazing Coins. And an amazing coin has to be nominated. And then I send a video of the coin, and then the regional business partner goes in and they hand it out. And then that creates an contagion. And then people want to one up each other, along the way. And the other portion of that is what I mentioned earlier of the three, which is honoring the past. So one of the things we do is created a circle of legacy at DCA by bringing the founders back, bringing these folks back. Private equity transactions, private equity can be pretty cruel to founders and owners from prior generations. It's like, oh, you made your money, get away from me. We never want to hear from you about. Like, forgetting about the investor hat, what is the right thing to do here? And so we created a circle of honor, actually took a playbook out of the NFL who does it very, very well. And how do we bring them back and allow them to lecture a little bit and allow them to say, letters to my younger self. Here's what I wish I would have known 20 years ago and 10 years ago. And so just creating an atmosphere around that, and it makes it more fun, and it certainly attracts the right people. I got on DCA's board and then came in as CEO. We had 70% turnover in our first year dentists, in our first year and a half dentists. 70%. And I started looking at the industry, and that was even worse than the industry where it was over 50%. Now we're down to where it's more appropriate, the 15, 20%. And then how do you do that? Well, again, obliquely. Focusing on these other things allowed our retention to get better. Human capital, upskilling dentists, getting people excited about meaningful, purposeful work, lifetime of creation of healthy smiles, doing all those kinds of things that allow us to really thrive as an organization and get there one step at a time.
This is so amazing, actually. I could talk to you all day. One of the things you talk about in your book is this concept of calcification of providers, and where providers are basically just doing the motions. And COVID kind of calcified that even more, right? Because, a bunch of providers left, hygienists left, doctors left. And now we're in a situation in dentistry where we have plenty of demand, but there's not enough supply of providers. And sometimes the providers are sometimes so burnt out that they're unable to even cater to the demand that already is calling them. And we see that at Patient Prism, obviously. The approach that you have here with positive psychology and, decalcifying the providers by creating this culture of celebrating the legacy, rewarding them for the things that they do well, has it made an impact in just getting the providers to say, yes, I want to see more patients. I want to think about how I can serve more of my community better by opening up the schedule, by thinking about schedule blocks a little differently so that I can see the patients. It's not about revenue. It's about me being able to serve my community.
That's a lot of questions there. So let me try and unpack this a bit. Let me start with kind of burnout, decalcification, and depersonalization. So there's two very, very different constructs. The first is it is very natural as you work day to day, regardless of what you're doing, especially if it's a patient-facing, type of profession, that you're going to, at some person, take a three-dimensional person and reduce them to two dimensions. It's now going to be Mrs. Jones's, back molars instead of understanding the whole patient. So you're taking a three-dimensional person to take him into a two-dimensional paper doll. And that's very natural. And that is, what we call calcification. All day long you're doing this. And by the way, we learned all this, ironically enough, through the, call center industry, where an enormous amount of research was done. This was all pre-COVID. We learned all about burnout and depersonalization well before COVID. And unfortunately, most organizations have ignored it because burnout is extremely real. I came from an environment where it's 50+%. Dentistry is quite high. We also knew that post-COVID, a good, call it 20-30% of dental hygienists never came back to work. 10-15% of dentists never came back to work. They found they could be a lot happier doing something else. They were, quote, burned out. But before you get to burnout, you actually go through depersonalization. That's very natural. That's very rare. That happens to everybody. So how do you teach people preemptive ways to recognize those symptoms and what to do about it? Pause breaks, whatever that is for you, meditation, taking a walk. Make sure that you do something throughout the day that's a hack, that when you come back to seeing a patient, you'll remember that they're three-dimensional rather than the back molar in room 4, right? And so you got to get that. So that's kind of a natural occurrence. Burnout, by the way, is more of a clinical diagnosis. It is that personified. It is the loss of zest that you have for your profession. It is feeling I'm not making any progress. I'm not making a dent in the world, that I'm not doing meaningful, purposeful work. In fact, I'm doing everything but meaningful, purposeful work. And so that has to be diagnosed and dealt with differently. And so we have implemented Call to Care and was in part manufactured specifically for burnout. And so you have to, as an organization, admit that it exists and then do something preemptively, about it. Then you mentioned something which is a contributor to burnout, which is an overemphasis on analytics and data and numbers. It is pushing the productivity. How many doctor days? One of the things I found out about DCA, which has an amazing data team run by Theo under James Nix's leadership. It's just an most unbelievable data team I've seen, and I've been around. Almost too much. I always tell them all the time, they're too good. I said, from now on, I want to come into a meeting and I want to know what our core 4 are. I only want 4 pieces of data, and one of them better be qualitative, right? Because we have way too much quantitative information. Well, in dentistry, there's not a tremendous amount of qualitative data thrown around. I've been to 3 or 4 conferences. I've never been to one lecture yet that talked about anything qualitative in dentistry. It's all about pushing productivity and BI tools and how I can get revenue cycle management better by implementing this and that and everything else, right? And so what I will tell you that by an overemphasis on productivity and numbers and doctor days and all that, there's a natural inclination, that goes up. I learned this many years ago from athletics. The best football coaches I ever saw that I had chances to get to know never mentioned the word discipline. They made it an assumption. They made it an expectation. Correlated the other way, those who all they ever talked about was discipline had more penalties and had more dropouts than anybody else, right? Again, obliquely. So what I found is that if you're going to be dentist-centric, the last thing I want to do is get them all in a meeting and beat them up about productivity and doctor days. What am I going to say that they don't already know? In fact, they know better than I know. So one of the things that we learned very on is, in the area like this, is one of the ways you get better productivity, you keep them busy. You get more patients for them. You help fill their schedules. You partner with them and say, you're going to make more money. And then what happens is they work more. They get in flow, which is this unbelievable state of mind. And then all your other things go away. You don't need to worry about doctor days, and you don't need to worry about, I also found out dentistry, which is way different than healthcare. That second visit in dentistry is the magical one, that produces the most production per visit, at least according to our data. And so you better do a good job of getting that patient to come back. That second time, well, how do you get them to come back? Passion, caring, customer service. If you measure too many visits, well, we're going to same-day dentistry, and we're doing all these amazing technology things. So more visits isn't necessarily better. That's one thing I learned in dentistry. It's more new patients is better for sure. But you do that, you get your dentist busy. We grew over 7% new patients this year against the industry norm, which is, 400 offices. That's pretty impressive when you look at, the industry as a whole and where we had been prior to. You know what happens when you get that kind of growth? You have less turnover. You have less disgruntled dentists. In fact, you have the opposite going on, and you have more dentists making more money. And guess what those dentists do? They tell their friends. They're in dental school. Come to DCA because it's an environment where they're truly going to partner with you, and they're going to truly help you thrive and flourish. So all these things kind of cycle back.
So refreshing from personal experience. You've been a founder, been on the board, now DCA. These are private equity-backed groups. And how do you thread the needle of this conversation we're having today with the incessant demand of the typical private equity you do need the data to tell the story, or at least that's being asked of you, I've got to imagine, unless you have somehow have the Jedi mind trick that I certainly didn't have. How do you navigate your investors, the board, metrics to, some of these qualitative metrics, qualitative things on clinical excellence, customer service, care excellence? How have you tried to thread that needle and get people behind you and hang in there with you? I'm sure there's some months go the wrong way and, hey, but we're making, progress.
Yeah, and certainly results have to occur. I mean, you have to be a results-oriented work environment. That's what we are. We're less concerned about process and very concerned about results. But your specific question was, how do you get your board to align with you in a private equity environment? Fortunately, I've got a lot of scar tissue around because I've been working in and around private equity for 30-some years. And private equity is not a real monolithic term. It's extremely variable by sponsor and by backer. And I've had minority private equity invested in me twice, and so that's very different. And then you get the change of control transactions, and that's very different. So I'm going to generalize here and tell you that these are things we're working on. These are the common language that I think really is the best of the secret sauce in these environments. It's because your boards typically in private equity are primarily the investors, and the investors are trying to get a track record. They want to have a transaction every 5 to 7 years, even when they say they have patient capital, even when they say they're there for the long haul. They're not, because they can't get their MOIC and they can't get their track records unless they have transactions. It's just the way that it is. But you also better hope that you have independent board members or those who are a little more ecumenical in terms of that aren't, necessarily from the investor side, that understand, maybe multi-site businesses or understand marketing or they understand subject matter expertise around it. Then you have all these folks around the room. And what I have personally found is kind of the way you thread the needle is by agreeing or understanding that amongst your board that we're going to have a value creation plan that we're all going to sign off on. Okay. And our value creation plan is what we're going to both do the bulk of the discussion with at our board meeting. And yeah, it's going to have some data. And yeah, it's going to have some results. And yeah, it's going to have all this. But then you avoid all these conversations. Why aren't the doctors working more? Why aren't the payers paying you more? Why does your reimbursement suck? Why does there's so much turnover going on? Why do hygienists get paid so much money? You start doing all those conversations and you're not bringing value to the enterprise. And so in our case, a value creation plan is signed off, and it usually is set around, in our case, 4 pillars: human capital, omnichannel marketing, operational excellence, and what I call real-time enterprise. And then within those 4 pillars, we have a variety of strategic initiatives underneath them. The strategic initiatives can get in they can get deep, right? They can get very granular, and the board level sometimes don't get into that degree of granularity. But we're going to go at that board meeting, we're going to make sure every one of those pillars in our value creation plan is addressed in that board meeting, including the financials. In fact, I don't even like having financials reviewed at board meetings. I think they're useless. Have a separate call on that. Go over that. That's very perfunctory, right? And then have the higher level things that your board member with maybe a theme each particular month. But you better have a real strong lead operating director or a lead managing director or board director to do that. I've been very fortunate in my career that I've had really good sponsor partners and who really understood and really, their left-sided brain understand why compassion and customer service are so important to an organization. They were at least smart enough to see that it acknowledged that it may impact results. And so I've been fortunate in that respect.
I always find that sometimes the best ideas are from similar industries that cross-pollinate into dental. Anything that you've brought over, automation, technology, that just, sometimes dentistry is a little incestuous and we're always doing it the same way we've always done it. Anything you've brought over or you think is, and maybe not in terms of automation, making the support to the units better that you've done in your previous ventures?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it at a high level first. I think when you have a broad platform, you have to talk about and have an adult conversation around the healthy tension that exists between decentralization and centralization, and have an understanding that we have made a decision collectively that we're going to keep this decentralized. We've made a decision that we're going to make it decentralized. Then you better as hell be a benevolent dictator and implement it along those ways. Now, you might have to be flexibility and all that kind of stuff. So one, you have to, in multi-site business, you have to do that. What I found in dentistry, oddly enough, DCA had a platform. And I mean that seriously. I mean, we have a good talent acquisition group. We have a really good revenue cycle management group. We are centralized relative to our EMR platform, generally speaking. We have orthodontists in there and they have a slightly different one. We also had, HR, payroll, and we had a lot of really truly a platform that we could leverage versus a lot of DSOs, which are a League of Nations, where they're just a collection. And some point they might do a little bit of marketing together. They might do a little bit of HR, but they not really have developed a platform. Right now, the reimbursements are at where if you don't create scalability in a real platform, what's going to happen? You're going to have lower margins. You're going to have less growth, and so you have have to have a platform to do it. So I brought that kind of mentality in it, but really brought in the notion of a healthy tension. I'll tell you where it manifests itself, because it's kind of surprising. Dentists, doctors, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and the like. After a while, they want corporate to do more and more and more and more. They say they all join your organization. No, we just want to leave things the way we want. But this comes up. Oh, we want you to have an AI strategy. Oh, we want you to pay the AI vendor. We want you to do this. We want you to do this. And you have to have somebody who's tough and who's a little bit of a benevolent dictator that understands shared service is a decision where you have to have a pretty doggone line of demarcation. That doesn't mean you might rethink things. I looked at organizations. I was fortunate enough to live in Louisville where we had Yum and David Novak, when he had all of these different brands like Pizza Hut and Taco Bell and on and on and on. I mean, one of the things they did was this incredibly shared services, and he was an incredibly successful CEO, but he was also very good at making sure that the shared services have an alignment there. With dentists and doctors, you have to do the same thing. Yes, hiring, for example. Hiring is a centralized, decentralized service. We can help bring you leads, but ultimately you've got to be responsible, and you're going to, don't blame retention problems on me when you're interviewing somebody and not really interviewing them and bringing them on and doing Zoom meetings instead of having them shadow you and do you the right way. And the other part of that, I think, is a playbook. What I think I've really brought to DCA, perhaps, arguably better than other things, is to have this really detailed playbook around every job description. What is the expectation? What is the job description? How do we do a performance development appraisal? How do we get somebody in a talent management process, a performance development plan? Our dental directors, we had 17 dental directors all doing 17 different things. We had regional business partners, not a lot of way they were being held in accountability. And so bringing that accountability to it has been something that you have to do. And I think, in healthcare, we've just been forced with reimbursement declines for 15 years. I came from an environment where Medicare paid us more 15 years ago than they do currently. So, that discipline of you're managing, I used to say we were a dime quarter business. Now we're a penny nickel business, and you got to manage the pennies and nickels. It's just a lot harder than managing dimes and quarters. So I feel like I feel like I was shaped in an environment that helped me in dentistry, because the dental pricing is not kept up with lockstep of inflation or education costs.
As you move into 2026, there's a lot of pressure. For DSOs to, achieve that same store growth. If there is a top initiative that's quantitative, if I may ask that question, if there is an initiative, what is something that the top 3 things you're trying to do that DCA does well in 2026 to drive that same store top line revenue growth?
Well, first, let's just acknowledge that, there's various ways to grow. To me, you have to do same store correctly. If you don't do same store growth correctly, you shouldn't be in the business of buying anything, because ultimately you're going to ruin those. Okay. And if you look at the M&A model in dentistry, you're going to have a hard time finding a lot of companies that have had successful, meaning that the eventual outcomes and EBITDA of practices they acquired exceeded baseline valuations. Okay. I've not seen a lot of it in dentistry. Okay. I saw a lot of it in healthcare, but I saw a lot the other way too. So organic growth has to be number one. Then if you do that well, de novo model is pretty enticing in dentistry, although it's capital intensive more so than others. And then M&A is okay as well, but think of relocations and refurbishments and adding on locations. So I come from more of an environment. I mean, we did 80 some transactions just at Confluent when I was there. So I had a strong M&A background, but we're not ready at DCA yet. We're getting on the thongs of it, because we had to get same store correctly. And then to me, expansions are a cheap way to grow, add more operatories, add more dentists. In these environments where I see a lot of dental practices that have a single dentist and maybe one and a half hygienists, I don't know how they're going to make it. Like, this is not the kind of business where you can have that small of a store anymore. It was probably 10 years ago, but with rental rates increasing where they're at, it's just very tough. So how do you get the playbook for your operating environment to get same store growth? And that's going to come through a combination of the things we talked about implementing, so you can grow your friends, family, patient numbers. Scheduling optimization is real critical. You have 400 offices, scheduling 400 different ways, it doesn't work. So you have to be a little bit of a benevolent dictator. You have to have this compassion and care, but you also have to have this czarist mentality on certain items where you have to be really dogmatic. Scheduling is one of them, and understanding how that works. Integrating technology to help you with patients that you might be losing, attracting patients that you might not be getting. And so getting that same sort of growth, but also getting your compensation models around your dentists are really critical. I think, I inherited a good group because they always had the reputation of paying well at DCA. We've changed the way we do all our guarantees for the first 6 months. We've changed some other compensation models there, and it's helped tremendously. Hygiene shortages have been, just really something that's not going to go away quickly. quickly. It's kind of like nursing. And so how do you engage more hygiene in your practice? And one of the things I didn't have, I guess one of the advantages I had was my inexperience in dentistry, because there was a bias around a certain operating model in dentistry, the so-called hygiene model. I still hear people talk about it all the time. It's very real. It's one way to work. But let me tell you, we have hygienists that produce a lot of money. Like we're not looking at them as a model to only feed the dentist. They on their own are doing quite well, and they could be. And so if you're only looking at how they feed the dentist, that's not necessarily a good thing. So we look at them as their own P&L center, and I think that's important. But those are just some examples, some of the ways we're trying to, we hadn't figured it all out either. Trust me. I mean, we're trying to learn from others, trying to understand best practices, and what are some of the technology integrations? You have Curidon, you have other kind of services that our hygienists are doing. Is that really helpful? You also have product issues. In dentistry, you have to have an incredible. Thank goodness we have scale, because your vendors, your suppliers are so critical to a dental practice that you don't even think about them mostly in healthcare, really. Like now I've got to choose between 1, 2, or 3 different places just to get our scanners, because the prices are immensely different. One of them is married to a certain product. Some of our folks like that product, so I'm still filtering some of the noise around all this, trust me. But that organic model is the key for us before we feel real comfortable buying anything. If you can't grow 3 to 5, 5 to 7% in that neighborhood year in, year out, then you really got to be careful about what you're trying to buy, because there's a frenzy around the buying. And what I've seen in dentistry, and my friend Dr. Greg White over at Pepperpoint says it best. He says it's been more of a bridge to retirement than it's been a lever arm to growth. I don't think he would say the lever arm to growth. That's what I would say, but he's exactly right on the first part of that statement. And that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. And maybe in the context of, your big initiatives, clinical excellence, customer service, and empathy, a lot of our listeners have 15, 30 locations. And I know when I was that size, it was just, I felt like I was putting out one fire after the other, or it was a little daunting. So if there are 20, 30 million of revenues, what's an idea if you just had to boil it down, do this the next 90 days to drive 100K of value? Could be revenues, 100K of EBITDA. What would be kind of a parting words of wisdom if you're speaking to some entrepreneur in that size?
Generally, there's a lot of things I would say. One of the things I used to say in healthcare was you've seen one market and you've seen one market. All strategy is local. Think small and stay local. I say that all the time. Think small and stay local. So if you've got 30 locations, you better have 30 strategic plans, because the difference between Lexington, Kentucky and Louisville, Kentucky, even though they're 50 miles apart, is vastly different. The payers are different. The employers are different. The people, the vibe, the culture is different. So you have to have a very locally driven strategic plan. In our case, we're so big that we have to have many. We do it more by region because we do have clusters. We do have a good hub and spoke system. So that would be one thing, is make sure your planning is in. Have a theme that is right or group. You have a strategic theme, you have a value creation plan, and then you have your individual strategic plans within those. And you have to be comfortable operating that, because there's, like I said, you've seen one market and you've seen one market. But I will tell you, if there's one thing that I've learned in healthcare and in dental, is that the data doesn't lie in the long run. It tells you the truth. And what the data tells me in dental is that you better have a local owner. So we have 400 locations at DCA. We have 200 and call it 23 where they're, what they stylistically call in the DSO world JVs, which just to me means you have a local owner, right? And my goal is to get all 400. If I get all 400 that have some local ownership, then I can sleep better at night and the results will speak for themselves. You could cut the data any way you want. Those that have ownership have better margin, better growth, better total EBITDA. And what are the 3 lever arms for valuation? Total EBITDA, growth, percentage of margin, right? And so one of the initiatives we worked on last year, and we've got a lot of momentum going into this year, we added 9 new partners. These are not new offices we bought. These are docs that are buying in locally, and we'll do about 30 some of them this year. And again, my goal is to get every office to do that. Now, does once in a while it fail? It does, but this data is so overwhelming. And what a lot of DSOs have done is they've made Topco, and those that do that are okay in the short run, but in the long run, you're going to run into some headaches. It's what I've seen. You're playing for the next turn, the burning bed of private equity. When am I going to get my next turn? Well, you know what? In private equity, I had a whole lot of turns in the last 5 to 6 years in dental, from what I could tell. I know there's a lot out in market now, and I hope they do incredibly well, because we need them to do well. We need everybody to do well. We absolutely do. But set your business up not for the next transaction, but for the best value creation. And if you do that, the one will begot the other.
This has been such a fantastic conversation. I did not expect to have this conversation. Our audience, I think, deserves a perspective that's new and that's fresh, away from all the quantitative stuff we talk about a lot. And we talk about a lot of quantitative strategies and optimizing every number, and that's important. But I think focusing on the human, and the work you've done with and then the psychology of providers and getting them in the best shape, I think is the right way to think about healthcare in general, because we're in healthcare because we want to serve our communities. We want to make our patients healthier. And if we don't start with that premise, then everything else falls apart. Because if your providers are not happy and they're not fulfilled, then everything, every model, every AI,